The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will now come to order. Today, the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations is holding a hearing entitled Oversight of Federal Efforts to Combat the Spread of Illicit Fentanyl. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the increasing threat posed by fentanyl and the federal government's coordination and response. The chair now recognizes herself for purposes of an opening statement. Today, we are once again here to discuss the opioid crisis, an epidemic that this country has been battling for years. Previously, this committee has taken numerous actions to investigate the origins and elements of the crisis and help bring relief to those who are suffering. Today's hearing will examine the growing threat of synthetic opioids, which experts have called the third wave of the opioid epidemic. Our communities have already been ravaged by prescription opioids and then heroin. Now, unfortunately, we are seeing significant increases in overdose deaths involving synthetic opioids like fentanyl, including in my home state of Colorado. Fentanyl is extremely dangerous. It's 50 times more powerful than heroin, 100 times more powerful than morphine, and it's responsible for a number of growing overdose deaths in America. Fentanyl is also cheap and it's easy to produce, giving a high return for those who seek to profit from the destruction that it causes. Fentanyl can be used on its own or it can be mixed with other drugs. Alarmingly, even amateur chemists can produce this highly dangerous drug with minimal resources and experience. It's often made overseas, likely in China, then shipped either directly to users in the United States or through intermediaries in other countries like Mexico. It can be bought anonymously on the dark web, and because it is so potent, small but deadly quantities of the drug can be shipped in packages via the U.S. mail or in private consignment carriers. Today, we have before us 6 agencies who play important roles in fighting the proliferation of fentanyl. Each is responsible for a piece of this effort, from guarding the border to taking down drug trafficking organizations to protecting the legitimate drug supply. These agencies will provide us with their assessment of how we got here, where the fentanyl threat stands right now, and how it has changed in recent months. And I want to thank each one of our witnesses for coming today. The purpose is to examine the state of fentanyl, but also our government's response to it. The threat is serious and evolving, and our response must be equally committed and adaptable. These agencies have experience enforcing our nation's drug laws, gathering intelligence against traffickers, and arresting powerful criminals. And we are thankful for their efforts. But fentanyl represents a unique problem, so these agencies need to develop new ways of attacking it. Because we've seen the opioid crisis evolve and take different forms, we also need to anticipate how fentanyl trends are likely to continue to change. I'm interested to hear all of our witnesses' perspectives on this, and how we can get ahead of the evolving threat so we're not caught flat-footed like we have been before, unfortunately. I'm struck by the diverse missions of this panel. It's not every day that we have a hearing with the U.S. Postal Service and the DEA on the same panel. Every one of these witnesses represents just a piece of the puzzle, which means that we cannot succeed unless everybody comes together. The crisis is going to require a massive coordinated effort to overcome. We frankly need a national strategy on fentanyl response. And I don't mean just a white paper document or a task force report. I mean we need a coherent, practical plan for how we're going to beat this problem. For example, the Office of National Drug Control Policy is supposed to formulate a strategy, bring all of the agencies together, and see to it that the strategy is implemented effectively. Are you coordinating the efforts of these agencies, and if so, how? Your mission is now more important than ever, so we will be looking to you for leadership and vision. DEA, you are on the front lines and often develop important leads for targeting drugs. Is that information being regularly shared with CBP so that it can adequately target fentanyl shipments when they come into the U.S.? FDA, suddenly you're in the middle of this fight because fentanyl's increasingly being mixed with other drugs, including counterfeit prescription drugs. How are you coordinating with law enforcement to protect the drug supply? These are just a few of the questions we will explore today. If we're going to solve this problem, we need better cooperation across agencies, and we need to think differently than we have on past drug epidemics. Finally, this hearing is just one piece of oversight. This subcommittee will stay on this issue and ensure progress is being made. So, as so frequently happens, unfortunately, we're not back next year talking about the same problems. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for their service on this critical issue and for coming here today all in one panel. And now the chair will recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Guthrie, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair DeGette, for holding this important hearing. The Energy and Commerce Committee has been steadfast in its efforts to help combat the opioid crisis with both investigations and legislation. Where there was the committee's investigations into opioid distributors, patient brokering, or major opioid manufacturers, we've continued to ask questions and demand answers for the American people. When it comes to legislation, this committee led the way on passage of the 21st Century Cures Act, the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, and the Support Act for Patients and Communities. I was proud to work with these three landmark bills, which are advancing treatment and recovery initiatives, improving prevention, protecting communities, and bolstering our efforts to fight deadly illicit synthetic drugs like fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that is 80 to 100 times stronger than morphine and 50 times more potent than heroin. For many years, pharmaceutical fentanyl has been utilized as a powerful pain medicine to treat severe pain, such as advanced cancer pain, commonly used in the form of a patch on the skin or a lollipop. But pharmaceutical fentanyl is not why we're here today. We're here today because of concerns over illicit or illegally manufactured fentanyl. The fentanyl crisis is particularly dangerous because of its high potency and the small amount required to potentially cause an overdose. It has become a powerful additive to drugs such as heroin, cocaine, or counterfeit pills, with or without the user's knowledge. According to the CDC, in 2017, there were more than 28,000 deaths involving synthetic opioids in the United States, which is more deaths than from any other type of opioid. Further, overdose death rates from synthetic opioids increased all across all demographics, county urbanization levels, in numerous states. A little bit of fentanyl goes a long way, which makes it harder for law enforcement to track where and how fentanyl is being purchased. Fentanyl can be purchased on the internet, both in open source and on the dark web, and can be purchased pseudo-anonymously using Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. In addition to being smuggled across our borders, fentanyl can be mailed in small quantities through the Postal Service or express consignment carriers, and therefore has a higher likelihood of coming into the United States undetected. These circumstances require a much different approach to intelligence, interdiction, in law enforcement compared to methods that may be better suited for what might be considered a more common drug smuggling operation. The threat is real and has been growing over the past few years. According to Customs and Border Protection data, in fiscal year 2015, 70 pounds of fentanyl were seized in the United States. In comparison, for fiscal year 2018, more than 2,000 pounds of fentanyl was seized. Further, for fiscal year 2019 to date, there have been 17,003 pounds of fentanyl seized, which is enough fentanyl for more than 600 million lethal doses of fentanyl. And we still have 4 more months of data to account for before we know the total for this year. I want to acknowledge some of the efforts and accomplishments of this administration, including but not limited to HHS establishing an interdepartmental substance use disorder coordinating committee, China pledging to add fentanyl to its list of controlled substances, increasing shipment tracking responsibilities and coordination among multiple entities, and disruption efforts, which has taken down an entire online black market. While we are already seeing new tools and resources provided and utilized as a result of this committee and the administration's work, the threat still exists and our work is not done. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. I look forward to hearing from all of you about successes we have had in combating our nation's fentanyl threat, but also how the threat has changed, what challenges remain, and what more we in Congress can do to be partners in this fight. I'll yield back.
Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This committee has held many hearings on the opioid crisis over the last several years, and with each hearing, it seems the challenge to combat the crisis grows even more daunting. While opioid prescribing rates appear to have gone down, overdose deaths continue to climb. Communities all around the country are still suffering from this epidemic, now largely at the hands of heroin and increasingly fentanyl. Fentanyl is a deadly synthetic drug that is 50 times more powerful than heroin. Because it's relatively easy to make and so potent, it is tragically leading to large increases in overdose deaths. We've all heard the terrible numbers that tell this story. In 2017, there were over 47,000 opioid overdose deaths. 28,000 of those deaths involved synthetic opioids such as fentanyl. And my home state of New Jersey, for example, has seen a 10-fold increase in deaths involving fentanyl in the last several years. And fentanyl represents the third wave, as the chairwoman said, in the opioid crisis. After the country was inundated with prescription opioids, prescribing rates went down, but many of those who were already addicted then turned to heroin. And now the trend is shifting towards synthetic opioids like fentanyl, which pose a unique threat. These drugs are manufactured overseas in countries like China, oftentimes in clandestine labs. These drugs are then shipped into the U.S., often in small quantities that are difficult to detect. And to make matters worse, we're now seeing fentanyl increasingly mixed into other drugs like cocaine, methamphetamine, and even counterfeit prescription drugs like oxycodone. This means that many unsuspecting people are dying at the hands of fentanyl when they didn't even realize they were taking it. And this drug represents an unprecedented threat to the U.S., and we have to do everything we can to stop its flow into our communities. Today, we're hearing from the key law enforcement and regulatory agencies on the front lines of this battle. Each agency plays a critical part and has decades of experience in this fight. The problem, however, is that fentanyl is unlike any drug crisis we've faced before. All of these factors point to one conclusion: we have to think differently about how to counter the spread of fentanyl. The old approaches simply will not suffice. Finally, we have repeatedly heard from experts that we cannot arrest our way out of the opioid crisis, and fentanyl is no different. Evidence-based treatment is the best hope for those suffering from addiction, and we must support programs that provide that help. So today's hearing focuses on how to stop the flow of fentanyl, but this is by no means the end of the conversation. I'm committed to providing Americans suffering from opioid use disorder access to the quality treatment they need, and this committee will continue to shine a spotlight on this crisis to help identify solutions, including in the treatment and public health arenas. I have about 2 minutes left, and I'd like to yield that now to the gentlewoman from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone. We have seen the opioid crisis evolve and take many different forms, as you described, but no community in this country has been spared. New England and New Hampshire in particular have been devastated by this crisis. In my home state, while we have seen the rate of prescription opioid and heroin overdose deaths decline, the rate of fentanyl-involved overdoses has not subsided. With the help of a coordinated approach at the local level, the hub and spoke model ensures that every Granite Stater has nearby access to treatment and recovery services. But this does not solve the supply problem. We know all too well that newer, stronger, and deadlier analogs of fentanyl continue to proliferate and challenge our ability to prevent needless premature deaths. I look forward to the hearing, I look forward to your testimony, and I thank the gentlewoman chairing this subcommittee and the chair of the committee for their attention to this crisis. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I don't have about a minute. I don't know if anybody else wants the time. If not, I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes for purposes of an opening statement.
Morning, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this really, really important hearing on getting illicit fentanyl off our streets. As you've heard, fentanyl is so deadly, a piece of it the size of a few grains of salt will kill you. It reportedly led to 49 deaths in Oregon in 2017. So ridding our communities of fentanyl is a key piece of combating the opioid crisis in Oregon and across the country. Illicit fentanyl is a tremendously difficult and dynamic problem. It is hard to detect, it is highly potent, and lucrative enough to be sent in small envelopes or packages. And while the heroin market was monopolized by large criminal groups, this fentanyl wave, it's harder to police. It is coming almost entirely from the black market on the dark web and clandestine labs in China and Mexico, with many mid-level and small operators in addition to drug smuggling operations like the cartels. This subcommittee last held an oversight hearing on illicit fentanyl back in March of 2017. The need for fentanyl-focused action was clear then. 2 years later, there are numerous significant accomplishments. Last year, the committee worked in a bipartisan way to enact the Support Act to bolster the fight against opioids such as fentanyl. This law has helped provide advanced electronic data of international mail shipments to help target and intercept illicit fentanyl. This act also provided the FDA with a new tool for deterring imports of illicit fentanyl. As you'll recall, Dr. Burgess went up to a mail distribution facility in New Jersey and learned a lot and brought that back to us. The Trump administration has spurred improved actions in the fentanyl fight. Our nation is getting at least some improved level of cooperation from the Chinese government on class-based scheduling, which helps remove an incentive for traffickers to introduce new substances in the fentanyl family for the purpose of evading controls. President Trump deserves credit for moving this bold proposal based on the longstanding work of the White House Office on National Drug Control Policy, the DEA, and the State Department. President Xi of China deserves some credit for agreeing to a commitment to crack down on fentanyl as a class. We'd like to see more there. While it's too soon to assess the impact, early indications are at least encouraging. And since February of 2018, DEA has imposed emergency scheduling of fentanyl-related substances, but we need to work with DEA and other federal agencies to find the best approach to make this scheduling permanent. The Stop Importation and Trafficking of Synthetic Analogs, or SITSA Act, which would have given law enforcement additional tools they need to get illicit drugs, such as fentanyl, off our streets without compromising important public health and research protections. That was included in our House-passed version of the Support Act, but sadly was not included in the final package that became law. Mr. Katko of New York, he sponsored this legislation. It would be a good place to start again, and we should make it law. In July of 2017, the Department of Justice announced the seizure of Alpha Bay. That's the largest criminal marketplace on the dark web and a major source of fentanyl linked to overdose deaths. The Alpha Bay takedown was an international operation led by the U.S. Both DEA and CBP recently made the largest seizures of fentanyl in U.S. history, and we thank you for that. Federal agents working with local police seized 50 kilos of fentanyl precursor in 2017. For the first time, the Justice Department announced indictments of Chinese nationals for conspiracies to distribute large quantities of fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. In May of 19, a darknet drug dealer was indicted for selling fentanyl online thanks to Homeland Security's investigations of year-long nationwide undercover action. And under agreement with the U.S. Postal Service, China Post is providing advanced electronic data on parcels mailed to the U.S. FDA and CBP signed an agreement in April 2019 to maximize inspection and detection capabilities to products such as fentanyl from entering the United States. So we salute these important federal workers and agencies for their work. But we know big challenges remain. More work's needed to get better cooperation from Mexico's law enforcement authorities. We need to remain vigilant with China on its fentanyl commitment. Much more needs to be done to collect better data on fentanyl trafficking and to improve data sharing. And we want to hear more on a strategy to disrupt fentanyl trafficking. We'll be asking questions how we can strengthen our efforts and what this committee can provide. The SUPPORT Act was a great start, but it's not enough. And Madam Chair, I'd remind you, we posted our final Oversight Investigations report on the committee's website and sent everybody a letter at the beginning of the year. There were some important recommendations there I hope we can eventually get to. Before I conclude, I want to take a moment to recognize Michael Gray. He is father of Amanda Beatrice Rose Gray. Amanda died of an overdose of pure fentanyl in January of 2018, pure fentanyl. Michael has been a tireless advocate fighting against the opioid epidemic and fentanyl. His efforts informed our work in the last Congress. He was incredibly helpful in that. And let us remember, as the face of this crisis, his daughter. And we thank you for being here, and we thank you for your work. Madam Chair, in conclusion, the Actis Foundation, we have a letter we'd like to enter into the record that we previewed with you.
Without objection, and I would add my thanks to you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Ray, for all of your tireless work.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Gentleman yields back, and I now ask unanimous consent that the members' written opening statements be made part of the record. Without objection, so ordered. I would now like to introduce our panel of witnesses for today's hearing. Mr. Kemp Chester, the Assistant Director of the National Opioids and Synthetics Coordination Group, the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. Welcome. Mr. Matthew Donahue, Regional Director, North and Central Americas, Operation Division, Drug Enforcement Administration at the U.S. Department of Justice. Mr. Thomas Overacre, Executive Director, Office of Field Operations, Custom and Border Protection at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Gary Barksdale, Chief Postal Inspector at the U.S. Postal Service. Mr. David A. Prince, Deputy Assistant Director, Transnational Organized Crime, Homeland Security Investigations, Immigration and Customs Enforcement at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and Carol Cave, Director of the Office of Enforcement and Import Operations, Office of Regulatory Affairs, Food and Drug Administration at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you all for appearing in front of the subcommittee today. You are aware the committee is holding an investigative hearing, and when doing so, has had the practice of taking testimony under oath. Do any of you have any objections to testifying under oath? Let the record reflect that that witnesses have responded no. The chair then advises you, under the rules of the House and the rules of the committee, you're entitled to be accompanied by counsel. Do any of you desire to be accompanied by counsel today? Let the record reflect the witnesses have responded no. If you would, please rise and raise your right hand so you may be sworn in. Do you swear that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? You may be seated. Let the record reflect the witnesses have now responded affirmatively, and you are now under oath and subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the U.S. Code. The chair will now recognize the witnesses for a 5-minute summary of their written statements. In front of each of you is a microphone and a series of lights. The light turns yellow when you have a minute left, and it turns red to indicate that your time has come to an end. And so let's start with you, Mr. Chester. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman DeGette, Ranking Member Guthrie, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today on this critical issue. The Office of National Drug Control Policy, under the leadership of Director Jim Carroll, leads the development of the administration's national drug control strategy and oversees its implementation. The 2019 strategy is a comprehensive plan to address the president's top drug priority, the current opioid crisis, while also focusing on the emergence of even newer synthetic opioids and other emerging crises, such as methamphetamine use and the increase in cocaine availability. As part of the Executive Office of the President, ONDCP is uniquely positioned and has played an integral role in coordinating a comprehensive approach to drug policy development and implementation. It has facilitated successful interagency collaboration, coordination, and problem resolution on myriad drug policy issues. To that end, ONDCP has led countless interagency efforts directly related to the illicit opioid problem set. ONDCP established the National Heroin Coordination Group, recently renamed the National Opioids and Synthetics Coordination Group, in the fall of 2015 to apply new thinking to the heroin and fentanyl problem and develop a novel approach to addressing it. We worked collaboratively with the interagency in 2016 to develop and issue the Heroin Availability Reduction Plan, or HARP, to guide and synchronize interagency activities against the availability of heroin, fentanyl, and fentanyl analogs. To this day, the HARP is the one document that brings together, contextualizes, and synchronizes the federal government activities at the federal, state, local, and tribal levels, as well as in the international domain. 10 times every month, our Opioids and Synthetics Coordination Group leads video teleconferences at all levels of classification and nationwide webinars where departments, agencies, state, local, and tribal officials and key embassies share information and synchronized efforts based upon a common understanding of the strategic trends related to the opioid problem set. This level of direct leadership has been instrumental in developing a better understanding of the crisis at all levels, as well as serving as the driver for collaboration and tangible results, both domestically and with international partners. Based upon our in-depth understanding of the opioid crisis, key issues such as the challenges of fentanyl detection, safe fentanyl handling, and the need for innovative public health approaches were brought to the forefront and are currently being addressed. Our partnership with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service has increased interagency understanding of the international and domestic mail flow into the United States and U.S. vulnerabilities in disrupting the fentanyl and synthetic opioid supply chain. Our collaboration with the FBI-led Joint Criminal Opioid and Darknet Enforcement, or JCODE team, U.S. Customs and Border Protection's National Targeting Center, and our management of key international relationships with Mexico, Canada, China, Afghanistan, and others have brought tangible results in disrupting the flow of these dangerous drugs across our borders. For example, because of the interagency focus on disrupting the fentanyl supply chain, in the spring of 2017, CBP began to imprint the odor of fentanyl on all narcotics detection canines, and now more than 450 dogs are trained, addressing a critical vulnerability in our detection capability. As the fentanyl threat grew in 2016 and 2017, the lack of good scientific information concerning the threat of fentanyl exposure had a chilling effect on U.S. law enforcement and our first responders. ONDCP initiated an interagency working group to develop and publish the fentanyl safe handling recommendations, and shortly thereafter, CBP released a companion roll call video in use today. ONDCP is leading an interagency process with the Departments of Justice and Health and Human Services to schedule fentanyl analogs before the temporary action expires, while providing a framework to address the dynamic illicit drug market in a more comprehensive manner and making all of these substances available to the research community. The National Drug Control Strategy states, quote, "While confronting today's drug crisis to arrest its growth and reduce its effects, we must also further develop the capability, knowledge, and infrastructure to respond to the evolving nature of the drug threat as we move deeper into the 21st century," close quote. The men and women of ONDCP are doing just that. I would like to thank this committee and your House colleagues for your foresight and leadership in addressing this critical national security, law enforcement, and public health challenge. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chester. Mr. Donahue, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman DeGette, Ranking Member Guthrie, and members of the subcommittee. It's my honor to appear before you today to discuss the critically important issue of illicit fentanyl and fentanyl-like substances that have had a tremendous impact on the health and safety of our communities. Illicit fentanyl and other fentanyl-like substances are especially dangerous drugs that are often far more potent and deadly than other drugs like heroin and cocaine. I've had the privilege of being a DEA special agent for almost 30 years, having worked in South America, the Caribbean, and now North and Central American region. When I reflect on my time with DEA, the challenge we face with the ongoing opioid crisis, along with the sophistication, capacity, and global reach of Mexican poly drug cartels, is what worries me and deeply concerns me the most. As the regional director of North and Central America region, I see firsthand every day the extreme lawlessness and other atrocities committed by the Mexican cartels to maintain their dominant market share to provide illegal substances to individuals in the United States. The ruthlessness of these cartels, combined with their callous greed, is devastating families and communities, resulting in an increase in violence and crime in the United States. Dangerous and highly sophisticated cartels operating in both Mexico and the United States have been and will continue to be the most significant source of illicit narcotics trafficked into and throughout the United States. When it comes to illicit fentanyl, China is the primary manufacturing source, as well as the source of precursor chemicals needed to manufacture fentanyl outside of China. However, I would be remiss if I didn't say that China has taken important action to stem this manufacturing by the extraordinary step of controlling the entire class of fentanyl-based drugs. History has shown that when China and the United States have jointly controlled a drug, it has drastically decreased its importation into the United States. However, Mexican cartels now have an increasingly important role in the fentanyl trafficking. We have witnessed a transition from importation of precursor chemicals for the production of fentanyl to the manufacturing of precursor chemicals and fentanyl within Mexico itself. This is a very alarming development. Fentanyl comes into the United States in three ways. It is shipped directly to the United States through the U.S. mail services. It is trafficked in through our northern border, and most importantly, it is trafficked over our southern border via Mexican cartels by various means and methods. In many cases, fentanyl comes in the form of counterfeit prescription pills. Oftentimes, people believe they may be ordering hydrocodone or oxycodone on the internet, but they're receiving a fentanyl or a fentanyl analog, which could lead to deadly consequences. As a leader of DEA in Mexico, I can say confidently that we have not been a spectator in this battle. DEA has the largest footprint of the United States government in Mexico. We are addressing this threat by focusing on efforts on identifying the supply chain and disrupting it. We are working bilaterally and judicially targeting dismantling the cartels. Through our more than 300 domestic and international field offices, our Special Operations Division, which works with our interagency and international partners, we are conducting large-scale investigations and prosecuting those who seek to profit and are responsible for the production, transportation, distribution, and sale of these deadly substances. Perhaps one of the most notable examples of these efforts is the 2016 arrest of Sinaloa cartel leader Joaquin Guzman Loera, commonly known as El Chapo, who coincidentally is being sentenced tomorrow in New York City. DEA will continue to investigate the biggest and most egregious organizations that are poisoning our communities. We will continue to focus on targeting drug cartels and significant organizations operating in and outside the United States, whose only motive is to make tremendous profits on unsuspecting and vulnerable populations. But there is more work to be done. On February 6, 2018, the DEA, using its authority under the Controlled Substance Act, temporarily placed all non-scheduled fentanyl-like substances in Schedule 1, and it has had a significant impact. Let me reiterate that point. The temporary control of all non-scheduled fentanyl substances has had a significant positive impact in this fight. The class control action has substantially slowed the rate at which new substances are introduced to and encountered on the illicit market. However, this temporary action expires February 2020, which is only 206 days away. Additionally, if lawful access is not addressed, criminals will continue to use our own laws to evade detection and exploit members of our communities as technology advances and law enforcement is prevented from judicial interception and collection. Make no mistake, no matter the challenge, DEA will never stop aggressively pursuing the most dangerous and prolific criminals trafficking in illicit drugs in our communities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before your subcommittee on this important issue, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Donahue. Mr. Overacre, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman DeGette, Ranking Member Guthrie, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I am proud to represent the men and women of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, our nation's unified border agency with a vital counter-narcotics mission. On a typical day, CBP seizes more than 5,800 pounds of narcotics that would otherwise make their way into American communities. While today's hearing focuses on the opioid crisis and its devastating effects, CBP is committed to stopping all illicit drugs from crossing our borders. For example, last month with our partners at Homeland Security Investigations and the United States Coast Guard, CBP seized more than 19 tons of cocaine on a container ship in Philadelphia. The cocaine had an estimated street value in excess of $1.3 billion and was the largest cocaine seizure in the combined 230-year history of the U.S. Customs Service and CBP. Compared to cocaine or methamphetamines, CBP seizures of fentanyl are relatively low. However, these seizures have increased dramatically in recent years, and that is cause for concern. In fiscal year 2013, CBP seized approximately 2 pounds of fentanyl. Last year, we seized over 2,100 pounds. Through June of this year, we have already seized as much as we did last year. Most of the fentanyl coming into our country does so at ports of entry along the southwest border. It's brought in by privately owned vehicles, commercial vehicles, even pedestrians. Less frequent is fentanyl entering through international mail packages and express consignment environments. In those cases, most of the shipments originate from China. However, the fentanyl in the international mail and express environments is far more potent and pure than the fentanyl crossing the southwest border. Stopping fentanyl and other narcotics takes a collaborative effort. Through CBP's National Targeting Center, we work with our partners to identify and disrupt fentanyl smuggling at ports of entry, international mail facilities, and express consignment courier facilities. Our partners include Homeland Security Investigations, the United States Postal Inspection Service, the Drug Enforcement Administration, Health and Human Services, the Food and Drug Administration, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, and numerous other domestic and international partners. Based on our encounters, CBP produces intelligence products to help identify the tactics, techniques, and flow of drug trafficking. This enhances targeting efforts and supports investigations. It also provides policymakers, agency leadership, and the intelligence community with information that can lead to drug interdiction. Information sharing, advanced electronic data, the targeting of precursors and pill presses are among the many elements that inform our actionable intelligence and allow us to combat narcotics trafficking in a dynamic threat environment. In addition, CBP uses a variety of technologies and techniques to detect and identify illicit drugs. With the support of Congress, we are making significant investments and improvements in these capabilities, including additional narcotics detection canine teams, enhanced field testing, and new non-intrusive inspection, or NII, equipment. NII contributes to more than 98% of the number and total weight of seizures. Currently, CBP scans approximately 2% of privately owned vehicles and 16% of commercial vehicles arriving at southwest border ports of entry. To enhance our capabilities, CBP has developed a new model port concept that prioritizes the use of drive-through scanning equipment to streamline the inspection process and increase scanning rates, thereby increasing the probability of interdiction. To protect CBP personnel who may be exposed to dangerous substances during the course of their duties, we have deployed more than 1,100 two-dose boxes of counter-narcotic naloxone to train personnel in the field. CBP was the first federal law enforcement agency to implement such a program, and we have already administered 9 life-saving doses to members of the public. Together, CBP and its partners are focused on enhancing collaboration and information sharing to reduce the amounts of illicit opioids that cross our land, air, and sea borders. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to tell our story. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Mr. Barksdale, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair DeGette, Ranking Member Guthrie, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate this opportunity to be here today to discuss efforts to combat opioids, including fentanyl. My name is Gary Barksdale, and I'm the Chief Postal Inspector for the United States Postal Inspection Service, the law enforcement.
Mr. Barksdale, can you move the microphone just a little closer? Thank you.
Winning the battle against illicit drugs in the mail stream is one of our top priorities. Postal inspectors work not only to remove drugs from the mail, but to investigate and arrest individuals and disrupt drug trafficking networks across the U.S. Internationally, the inspection service is working aggressively to stem the flow of illegal drugs entering the country. Due to the opioid crisis, nearly 2 years ago, we created an internal team of cross-functional subject matter experts specifically focused on narcotics trafficking through the mail. The Contraband Interdiction and Investigations Team, or CI2, uses enhanced investigative methods, deploys resources as needed, and strengthens strategic partnerships to achieve significant improvements in our ability to seize fentanyl and synthetic opioids from the mail. The inspection service works closely with other law enforcement agencies to share intelligence, coordinate cases, and conduct joint enforcement operations to maximize our resources and impact. Relationships with partners such as DEA, HSI, CBP, and FDA allow us to better advance our mission to enforce the laws that defend the nation's mail. Inspection Service personnel are assigned full-time at ONDCP, the DEA Special Operations Division, the National Infusion Center, and CBP's National Targeting Center. Internationally, a postal inspector is now detailed at Europol in The Hague. We also work with state and local law enforcement to share intelligence and conduct joint operations, including several inspection service sponsored task forces. These relationships facilitate communication and data sharing that enable the identification of drug trafficking organizations, which would not be possible without interagency cooperation. The Inspection Service launched a cyber and analytics unit to enhance investigative techniques to better utilize data to target parcels. Due to many illicit dark web vendors relying on physical delivery networks for their products, the Inspection Service is involved with the investigations into vendors and the takedown of their illicit marketplaces. The Inspection Service has also joined DHS, CBP, and ONDCP as a sponsor for the Opioid Detection Challenge, which is a global prize competition for rapid, non-intrusive detection tools that will help find illicit opioids in international mail. Postal inspectors interdict and seize thousands of illegal drug shipments in the mail. From fiscal year 2016 through 2018, we achieved a 1,000% increase in international synthetic opioid seizures and a 750% increase in domestic synthetic opioid seizures. Thus far in fiscal year 2019, we have seized 185 synthetic opioid parcels, 153 of which were in the domestic mail stream. Our current stats represent a decrease in international seizures, while our domestic seizures are trending up. This shift may suggest synthetic opioids are increasingly entering the country through means other than international mail. In 2018, Congress enacted the STOP Act, which requires the Postal Service to receive advanced electronic data, or AED, on at least 70% of aggregate inbound package shipments, including 100% of shipments from the People's Republic of China by December 2018, and 100% of all inbound international shipments by December 2020. The volume of inbound packages with AED has improved from 26% in October of 2017 to approximately 60% in May of 2019, while the volume of packages with AED from China has increased from 32% to approximately 85% in May of 2019. This represents a significant improvement within a relatively limited period of time. The Postal Service continues to collaborate with foreign postal operators and organizations that support international postal operations to work towards obtaining AED on 100% of inbound packages and shipments. We have significantly improved coordination with CBP and developed processes to ensure we take action on requests to hold packages for inspection. The Postal Service currently has a 93% success rate in the capture of CBP hold requests, and it will continue to focus on deploying technology to improve interception capability and reach 100%. The Postal Service takes seriously its mission to protect the security and sanctity of the mail and is committed to taking all necessary actions to combat illicit drugs in the mail. Thank you for this opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Barksdale. Mr. Prince, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman DeGette, Ranking Member Guthrie, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss my agency's efforts in attacking the national opioid crisis impacting our communities. Homeland Security Investigations is the department's primary criminal investigative agency and is focused on disrupting and dismantling transnational criminal organizations. As the sole investigative agency with combined customs and immigration authorities, HSI investigates and enforces more than 400 federal criminal statutes that protect our nation's trade, travel, financial, and immigration systems. Today, I would like to speak about our successful efforts in combating the flow of illicit fentanyl into the United States. In fiscal year 2018, HSI initiated 1,393 opioid-related criminal investigations, executed 5,262 opioid-related criminal arrests, and seized a total of 9,928 pounds of opioids, which consisted of 2,737 pounds of fentanyl and 7,103 pounds of heroin. Our 2019 fiscal year statistics are set to exceed 2018 statistics in these areas. HSI has collaborated with Chinese authorities to address the China-sourced fentanyl threat through investigative information sharing. As of May 1st, 2019, Chinese authorities passed legislation making all fentanyl illegal. However, it still remains a threat. We are now urging General Administration of China Customs and China Postal Services to secure its mail and express consignment industry. Through our transnational criminal investigative units in Mexico, HSI works to disrupt Mexico-based opioid TCOs. TCIUs are multidiscipline units comprised of foreign law enforcement officials who ensure that shared information and operational activities are collaborated upon without compromise. HSI's customs authorities extend to the virtual border of the open internet and the dark net. HSI Cyber Crime Center, known as C3, provides support and assistance to global cyber investigations targeting illicit marketplaces where fentanyl and opioid sales proliferate. Today, HSI has more than 700 open cybercrime investigations and more than 200 investigations specifically targeting criminal darknet organizations. Many of these investigations focus on illicit opioid suppliers. HSI is at the forefront of cyber investigations and has been successful in developing methods to track and trace digital cryptocurrency, often used as a payment system for online opioid transactions. In fiscal year 2018, HSI delivered its online international opioid smuggling training course to more than 4,000 local, state, federal, and international law enforcement partners. This course provides law enforcement with the technical knowledge and in-depth case briefings to assist criminal investigations involving the darknet and cryptocurrency-related crimes. The Border Enforcement Security Task Force, known as BEST, utilizes local, state, and federal agencies at land, border, seaport, international airport, and mail facility locations to target TCOs. There are currently 65 BEST teams across the United States, and we have increased our presence at international mail facilities and express consignment carriers to include JFK, LAX, Memphis, and Louisville. We have also established BEST teams in areas hardest hit by the opioid epidemic, such as Ohio and West Virginia. In fiscal year 2018, BEST Memphis initiated 204 narcotic-controlled deliveries, executed 46 criminal arrests, and effected 149 seizures. BEST Cleveland has initiated Operation Darkness Falls to target top darknet vendors. Darkness Falls has led to the disruption and dismantlement of large-scale opioid vendors to include the largest identified fentanyl vendor with the most verified transactions. The National Targeting Center Investigations, NTCI, partners with CBP and Postal Inspection Service to interdict illicit opioids entering the United States. Recently, NTCI assisted in an investigation where 171 pounds of fentanyl was seized from a New Jersey-based TCO involved in the importation of opioids. To date, this investigation is one of the largest domestic seizures of fentanyl from China. HSI seeks to identify, disrupt, and dismantle criminal financial networks and leverages a multitude of investigative techniques to target money service businesses, bulk cash smuggling, and cryptocurrency. In fiscal year 2019, thus far, HSI seized nearly $1.9 million in fentanyl-related digital currency and has over 268 open investigations involving the illicit use of cryptocurrency. I'm grateful for the opportunity to appear before you to share HSI's efforts to combat the opioid epidemic. We will continue our commitment to maximize our full complement of authorities. I thank you for the support that you provide to HSI as we execute our mission, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Prince. And Ms. Cave, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairwoman DeGette, Ranking Member Guthrie, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss the Food and Drug Administration's role in combating our nation's ongoing crisis of opioid addiction, specifically regarding fentanyl. I'm Carol Cave, the Director of the Office of Enforcement and Import Operations within FDA's Office of Regulatory Affairs. FDA, along with our partner government agencies, continue to work together to consider more active and creative steps to make inroads against this crisis. I am pleased to be here today to discuss the work we are doing at our nation's borders and at the international mail facilities, or IMFs. FDA plays an important role related to the interdiction work that takes place in IMFs and has acted to enhance our operations there. In the international mail environment, Customs and Border Protection is the leading interdicting authority for controlled substances, including fentanyl and other opioids. As such, they examine before FDA and generally will act against these types of shipments without forwarding for FDA for review. FDA is focusing on inspecting and sometimes testing products that may be counterfeit or unapproved drug products. Last year, Congress gave FDA more tools to intercept illicit drugs coming through our nation's IMFs by enacting the SUPPORT Act. On behalf of FDA, I would like to thank the members of this committee for your work on these important authorities. The SUPPORT Act, specifically Section 3022D, gives FDA new authority to treat imported articles as drugs when they meet certain requirements, even in the absence of certain evidence of intended use. This allows FDA to apply its existing authorities to appropriately detain, refuse, and administratively destroy these subject articles. The implementation of this section, which began in March of this year, has been an unquestioned success. For articles determined to be under the 801U product specifically, our destruction rate is roughly 99%, thus eliminating distribution of these products into the hands of consumers. Additionally, on April 4th of 2019, FDA and CBP leaders signed a letter of intent that addresses the areas of cooperation outlined in Section 3014 of the Support Act, including information sharing, operational coordination for better targeting of high-risk parcels, and collaborative strategies. FDA and CBP have actively been exploring ways to enhance collaboration and increased efficiency of operations by sharing existing but limited space. As FDA is able to increase the amount of space allocated to its activities in the IMFs, FDA can further add staff, enabling the agency to expand its miscibility review of drugs shipped into the U.S. international mail parcels. The letter of intent also addresses FDA's and CBP's commitment to establish expanded scientific presence at the IMS, considered most at risk of receiving opioids and other illegal or dangerous drugs entering the United States. FDA and CBP are looking ways to develop and refine laboratory-based methods to identify unapproved, counterfeit, and other unlawful controlled substances. The Division of Import Operations managers have met several times with their counterparts at CBP and U.S. Postal Service to assess how our respective systems can be utilized to share data and information on actions taken by the agencies on individual parcels and commodities. All three agencies are considering the most appropriate and efficient means of using existing data streams to share IMF-specific data and investigational outcomes. We remain committed to using our regulatory authority to the fullest extent to address the opioid crisis, including using new authorities granted to FDA by the Support Act. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cave. It's now time for members to ask you questions, and the chair will recognize herself for 5 minutes. Mr. Donahue, combating fentanyl is challenging because, as we all know, it's cheap and easy to make, it has huge profits, it's hard to detect in shipments, and it's deadly even in small amounts. It's also increasingly mixed into other drugs, often without the user's knowledge, and so that leads to more overdoses. Would you agree with me with that assessment of the challenge that we're facing?
Yes, Congresswoman, I appreciate the question, and it's not an easy one because it's with all the drugs and the fentanyl and the different types of drugs coming in from other countries, where we're required to have their cooperation when we actually investigate these cartels, specifically here with the fentanyl coming in, where we're concerned with China, sometimes India, sometimes Holland, where the drugs are coming in directly to the United States and or to Mexico to produce it and send it up.
But it's because of all the things I said, it's harder to make those identifications, and so working with the other countries is even more important. Wouldn't that be fair?
Extremely important, and with our other panel members here as well, working collectively on attacking the people who are actually producing the drugs and shipping the drugs. And actually, really, the key is prosecutions.
Right.
We got to do something with the seizures that we make in the United States and bring it back to the source countries and gain their cooperation to attack the source of the drugs.
To do it there. Mr. Chester, your agency has been trying to coordinate drug control efforts for a long time. What are we doing to think outside the box in addressing the fentanyl threat that's different from what we've been doing with some of the previous illicit drug control strategies?
Thank you for the question, ma'am. I think we've done a couple of things. The first one is we have, through our interagency coordination and our work with the intelligence community and with partner nations, we are a generation ahead of where we were before in understanding the problem first, which I don't believe we had a good grasp on what the nature of the problem was, and we didn't have an ability.
When was that? When was that?
This was really about the 2014, 2015 timeframe. And so what this does is, with this greater understanding, we can look beyond the immediate actions that we take and are better able to anticipate trafficker actions and switching to other synthetic opioids. I think that's the first thing. And then I think the second thing is we look outside of the bounds of one particular class of drugs to things like non-synthetic opioids and things of that nature. And our understanding has allowed us to be able to be much more anticipatory than we have been in the past.
Do you think that the agency cooperation has been different than it was before, and if so, how?
Absolutely. I think the level of information sharing, the first one is the mechanisms that we have put in place. And when I say 10 times every single month, all of the members of this panel and the agencies and departments that they represent, we have mechanisms to share cooperations at all levels of classification, the ability to coordinate, and the ability not only to shape our own actions domestically, but our approach with other countries as well, much, much better than it has been in the past.
Mr. Overricker, I'd like to ask you, do you agree that the agencies are doing a better job of sharing data and working together than in the past?
Yes, I believe so. My experience tells me that when we can link up, investigators with operators, we can do a better job of basically identifying targets and supporting, investigations in the field. This is something we've done at our national targeting center. It's been successful, and now with the fentanyl crisis, we've really amped up our capabilities for that purpose.
What is it that you're doing differently now? Obviously, we can all agree that coordination is great, but what is it that you're doing differently?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say it's different, just to say that I think what we've learned over the years is we have to be working on this daily. It has to, it's a collaboration, and it really is something you have to work on every day. And I think it's just the level of collaboration we have for the fentanyl crisis is more than what we've seen for other issues in the past.
And what can we do to help you do your job better? Is there a better way to share data across agencies? Is there something that we can do to help?
Well, we certainly appreciate your support, your continued support for CBP. As far as data sharing, we do have, data sharing arrangements that with all of these agencies, and because we work collectively at our National Targeting Center, we're able to share information in a sort of rapid real-time format.
Okay, thank you. I head back and recognize Mr. Guthrie for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I want to go down the panel with this question, and so be mindful, I got to do that in 5 minutes and ask a couple of other questions too. So I'm going to be, so I just want each of you to say your agencies, what you was in fentanyl, what is your biggest accomplishment the past 2 years, your agency? I know you've done a lot, but your biggest, and then what your biggest challenge is.
I would say that our biggest accomplishment is the publishing of the National Drug Control Strategy, which contextualized everything the departments and agencies are doing in this particular regard for all drug issues, but in this one specifically. I would say that our biggest challenge is the rapidity with which new substances appear in the United States, either across our borders or are detected in postmortem toxicology testing. That is something that requires an enormous amount of effort.
Thank you. Mr. Donahue?
I would say one of our biggest accomplishments is actually emergency scheduling all analogs of the fentanyl, which has really greatly helped DEAs in our investigations. One of our biggest challenges is actually obtaining the evidence required to enter the grand jury in the United States to target these cartels that are producing and trafficking fentanyl in the court of law in the United States. We recently established our Sensitive Investigative Unit specifically for that reason, to work with our counterparts to obtain evidence in the foreign countries to utilize back in the grand jury in the United States. But that's a very big accomplishment for us that we're going to use going forward.
Thank you. Mr. Overricker?
From a CBP perspective, I would say one is our detection capabilities. We now have a fully staffed 24/7 laboratory in Springfield, Virginia, dedicated exclusively to fentanyl, and we've also deployed detection equipment throughout CBP so we can identify fentanyl in a safe way. I'd also say that our collaboration with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service is another big success story for us as we've increased our level of effort with them. And also just through our National Targeting Center, the partners that we work with there, and the coordination efforts, the sort of community of effort that we've established through the National Targeting Center is important.
Thank you. Mr. Barksdale?
Thank you. I would say our biggest accomplishment, as Mr. Overricker has said, is our collaboration and data sharing by embedding inspectors at the National Targeting Center and DA's SOD. I've seen a difference in the type of cases we're making. And as far as challenges, I think our biggest challenge is also one of our biggest successes. Is although we've improved our capability to attack the problem of internet sales, it still will be a challenge going forward. Because as good as we are as taking down one site, they're quickly put to stand up another site or a different marketplace. So that'll be a challenge going forward.
Thank you. Mr. Prince?
I would say some of our things that we can definitely say we've accomplished is our development of the Innovation Lab, which is something we bring problem sets to help us expand our capability to deal with stuff like opioids and our expansion of the BEST initiative as well, particularly our recent expansions, which we think are going to bear fruit. Our blockchain analysis as well in the cryptocurrency space is something that we're very proud of. We continue to make inroads in that, and it helps us develop much more robust target packages on our complex conspiracy investigations. Obviously, China is recalcitrant when it comes to a lot of these issues that we're dealing with that was part of our oral testimony, and I would say that's a challenge that we continue to deal with.
Thank you. Ms. Kay?
Good morning. I would say the number one thing for the FDA is clearly the 801U authority that was given to us by the Support Act, which actually allows us to destroy product when it's coming in, as opposed to refusing emission and exporting. So thank you very much for that. In terms of challenge, I would say it's just in the international mail facilities in terms of the volume and the sheer volume that we're dealing with, and the advanced, lack of advanced data that comes in, for example, on addressing those issues.
A colleague of mine, a couple of them have seen different targeting centers thing you're talking about, and just amazed at the effort that you guys are doing and working. And the second of all, and just also amazed at the volume you're dealing with, so what you just mentioned. So we're mindful of that. I hope to see one of those as well. Mr. Donahue, I have just less than a minute left, but the Wilson Center Mexico Institute reported that fentanyl is entering Mexico via the ports of Manzanilla and Lázaro Cárdenas. We say Cárdenas with our colleague here, but Cardenas. Do you agree that with that finding, and if so, what level of cooperation is DA getting from Mexico law enforcement authorities at these ports in detecting and seizing fentanyl? And one other, I'll go ahead and ask the second question, and may answer them together. In an interview with the Wilson Center Mexico Institute, Mexico Federal Forces said that they did not believe that fentanyl was a significant part of a Mexican drug trafficker's criminal portfolios. In your opinion, what do you comment on that? So,
Well, there are both two big ports where we see enormous amount of precursor chemicals coming in, not just for fentanyl, but for methamphetamine and for production of heroin as well. We are seeing chemicals coming in through the airports as well from China in various forms. We were working with OFAC as well to take those addresses that we're getting in China and working with our offices in China to follow up to see what laboratories are coming from. So you see large numbers coming in through the ports, but we also see them coming in through the airports and other smaller ports as well in Mexico. And our assessment and active investigations and intelligence, they are synthesizing fentanyl inside of Mexico, and we've seen pill mills with industrial size pill presses making fentanyl pills inside of Mexico, specifically on the border, and we've had seizures in the airports of pills.
thanks. I didn't leave you much time to answer. My time's expired, so I appreciate your answer.
Thank you so much. Chair now recognizes Ms. Schakowsky for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair and ranking member, and I thank you all for coming today to testify. I'm really glad that you're all gathered together to discuss this critical issue, and I believe it will require a broad government approach to tackle the spread of illicit fentanyl across the public health, law enforcement, and international relations sector. In particular, I'm glad that in recent years, both the legislative and executive branches appear to have realized the devastating failure of the previous war on drugs and have turned to a system of helping rather than locking up drug users, which has led to mass incarceration of hundreds of thousands of Americans, mostly brown and black. Recently, Secretary of Health and Human Services Alex Azar indicated that he would be fully in support, for example, of needle exchange programs as part of his agency's plan to combat the HIV epidemic. But needle exchanges are also critical responses to the opioid epidemic. In Illinois, Lindsay Hartman of Kane County runs a van every Saturday that provides clean needles, clean straws, naloxone, and everything else a drug user needs to stay alive. And thankfully, the Illinois State Legislature passed a bill last month to ensure public health vans like Lindsay's can continue to run without fear of legal repercussions. One important item that's on that van is our test strips that can detect the presence of fentanyl in drugs. A recent study from RTI International found that, quote, people who use illicitly made street opioids and test them for fentanyl by using fentanyl's test strips are 5 times more likely to engage in safer drug use behavior than when the test comes back positive. So you can, end quote. So you can imagine, I was disappointed to learn that Assistant Secretary of Mental Health and Substance Use, Dr. Eleanor McCants, has publicly come out against the use of these test strips. And she wrote, quote, is it our goal simply to stop people from dying so they can continue a life of safe, in quotes, heroin use, or should our goal be different, end quote. So Mr. Chester and Ms. Cave, and then anybody else who would like to respond, do you believe that fentanyl testing strips and other similar innovative measures are essential to preventing death, and shouldn't that be an objective in light of the current fentanyl epidemic?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I can't speak on behalf of anyone else. I can just...
No, I'm asking you.
Yeah, understand. The approach is we laid out in the drug control strategy is 3 pillars, and 2 of those 3 pillars are public health. One of them is to prevent drug use before it starts, and then the second one is to provide treatment leading to long-term recovery. Those are our main efforts, and any public health interventions, and when I mentioned in my testimony innovative public health interventions, there are a wide range of things that we discuss and that we consider. We look for their efficacy in the public health space. All designed to save lives and to get people on their path to recovery. That is our principal concern, and that is the bulk of our efforts in the public health space, specifically when it comes to opioids.
So saving lives is a goal.
Absolutely, that is the single, and as it states in the strategy, the single criterion of success is to save American lives and stop Americans from losing their lives to these deadly drugs. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Ms. Cave.
So to echo that, I would say I'm not a scientist or a physician either, and so I would take this back to our department and have them answer as an HHS response in terms of what their opinion would be on this issue.
Okay, but it doesn't take a scientist, it seems to me, if test strips would actually show that fentanyl is present and prevent people, 5 times more people's lives saved because of it, that's really a values question.
Right, I would say safety obviously is number 1.
Okay, thank you, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. McKinley for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank you for holding this hearing. But I got to tell you, I'm really disappointed that it's taken us 7 months to have another hearing on this topic. 7 months. It looks like we're going to get started again because we had a hiatus from the last Congress. Think about it, during the last Congress. We had H.R. 6, we had CARA, 21st Century Cure. We were having multiple hearings on this, and then all went silent. But I thank you for bringing it back up again. But I think everyone has to understand, during that hiatus, during that period of time, 7 months, 215 people died yesterday from substance abuse. 215 people died today. 215 people are going to die tomorrow. In my state of West Virginia, the epicenter of this problem, we have 1 person dying every 8 hours from drug problem. I think we need to be faster with this. So let me question, though. The theme or the concept that I'm still struggling with is that why, and I've had conversation with NIH, we've had conversations with other folks, why are Americans turning to drugs to deal with their problems? Why is it that we have such a problem? I've got the report here that has been filed that talks about why America is leading the globe in the use of drugs. As an example, in France, about 350 people died 2 years ago from drug overdose. Out of 66 million, that's at half of a person per 100,000. In Ohio, it's 35. Nearly 40 persons per 100,000 is dying from drugs. Why is France not using drugs? What are they doing right in France? Or take England, for example. England's ratio of deaths overdose by drugs is 4 per 100,000. In West Virginia, it's 52. What are we doing about it? What are we actually doing? Some of you, like Mr. Barksdale, it's not your issue with the poster, but I want to understand, why are Americans turning to drugs so rapidly and quickly instead of finding another way to deal with drugs? Because what we're dealing in this hearing right now is the results. We want to chase the drug after it's come here. I want to understand why our kids, adults, others, are turning to drugs in the first place when the rest of the world isn't. They're finding other ways to deal with this problem. So I'd like maybe each of you to tell, why is it that you think America is using drugs at such a greater rate than any place else in the world? Start with you, Mr. Chester.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I'm not prepared to answer why that is. I don't know, just as you don't. I think that there are a lot of variables as to why individuals choose to use drugs. However, I will say that we no longer speak in terms of supply and demand. We speak in terms of availability and use, because we do know, and our experience has shown, that the greater availability of drugs in a community, the greater chance that an individual will be able to use them for the first time, and that first use leads to chronic use very, very quickly, particularly with opioids.
That's fair. I'll reclaim my time on it. Last year, we had Zuckerberg in here, Facebook. We had Dorsey in here from Twitter. And both of them were saying how, thumping their chest, they don't use, they don't sell, they don't allow that to be sold on their platforms. But yet we demonstrated on both occasions that you can get drugs without prescriptions with Facebook, Twitter, Google, all these other accounts. And within hours, each of them pulled it back down again. But I'm here to say, I'm told they're back up again. So regardless of, we took them to task, they're back out there again. So we talk about availability. Are our social media platforms, are they being used? And how can we structure that? How can we in Congress do a better job to prevent Facebook, Twitter, and others from selling drugs over the internet? Mr. Donahue?
Well, two things. I will get with our demand reduction unit in our DEA headquarters. It's an important question that you asked, and I'll get you our answer and our opinion that we got with DEA why people are using drugs. I know one of the things we're always pushing for is the ability to be able to judicially intercept devices, Facebook, other things that we currently can't do with the judicial order, which causes a huge problem for law enforcement to infiltrate certain organizations, not having the ability to get into certain encrypted devices.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Chair
I yield back.
recognizes the gentlelady from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again for holding this hearing. As we know, the opioid epidemic continues to impact communities across this country. This is a crisis that knows no demographic and impacts urban and rural communities like mine alike. My home state of New Hampshire has been one of the hardest hit by the country's fentanyl crisis. This is a crisis that knows no border, no ocean deep enough, no continent broad enough to stop the flow of deadlier and deadlier fentanyl analogs. As the epidemic evolves, we must evolve our approach to combat it. And if one thing having all of these agencies before us today has shown, it's that there's a greater need for an even more coordinated approach across international, national, and local agencies. I want to start with you, Mr. Chester. As you've relayed, fentanyl is the biggest driver of overdose deaths, providing the best business model to drug traffickers and being the hardest to detect. You told committee staff that enforcement has historically been focused on interdicting 20th century drug trafficking, and that it has taken us a while to develop the architecture and means to combat 21st century drug trafficking. What do you mean that fentanyl trafficking is following a 21st century architecture, and what challenges do we face in adapting our strategy to meet this new threat?
Thank you for the question, ma'am. And I do want to be clear about one thing. We still have a 20th century drug trafficking problem in the United States, and that's principally heroin. And New Hampshire is one of our state partners that we hear from every single month, and we've seen how heroin has tapered off in New Hampshire, while synthetic opioids like fentanyl and fentanyl analogs have continued to rise. 20th century drug trafficking, plant-based drugs that are packaged, moved across the borders through a hierarchical drug trafficking organization, and that ends in a face-to-face cash transaction somewhere. That's what we refer to as 20th century drug trafficking. 21st century drug trafficking is an individual who does not need to interface with a drug trafficker or a drug trafficking organization, can get on their own laptop, they can get on the dark web, they can go to a vendor that will sell them the drugs, they can pay for it with Bitcoin, it will be delivered directly to their house through the mail service or through express consignment. That's what we refer to as 21st century drug trafficking. Unfortunately, we have both of those models that we are dealing with right now. And I will tell you that our law enforcement community and our State Department and our other partners have done a remarkable job in being able to take on the 21st century drug trafficking. At the same time, we are still dealing with the traditional model that we've dealt with for 30 plus years of drug policy.
So, thank you. Mr. Prince, fentanyl poses unique challenges compared to other drugs. Cheap to make, clandestinely produced in labs, easily transportable, and as we know, hard to detect. Traffickers are increasingly mixing the drug into other narcotics as well as counterfeit prescription drugs. I ask you, what is HSI doing to tackle the fentanyl epidemic that's uniquely different from its efforts to combating heroin, cocaine, and other narcotics?
Thank you for the question, ma'am. As my colleague had illustrated the 20th century versus 21st century drug problem, I call it analog versus digital. Our analog methodologies haven't changed in 35 years: surveillance, informant management, cultivation, development, cooperating defendants, execution of search and arrest warrants. Those are all our analog tools that we use that are always going to be relevant. They'll be relevant 100 years from now. As far as how we deal with the digital aspect of it, we have our innovation lab that I mentioned earlier. We have our NTC and NTCI. NTCI is placed very squarely in NTC where there's information sharing. Many of the people here on the panel are part of NTCI or NTC, collaborate with us on a daily basis. We have the OCDEF program that shepherds large-scale federal investigations in a collaborative team effort. And the two meet. At some point, the digital cryptocurrency space, the dark net activity, is going to turn into something at the corner of what I say walk and don't walk, where a drug deal is done. And that's where our ability to deal with the digital space, while at the same time dealing with the analog space, is going to bear fruit. In my oral testimony, I mentioned just a few cases that developed into some significant opioid and fentanyl seizures. That's a collaboration of the digital space mingling with the analog space and providing arrests, seizures, and significant results. Many of those investigations are ongoing. Some of those investigations are over, but we are moving with the digital transformations of the criminal enterprises. We're keeping up with what's going on.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, thanks to the panel. We have two hearings going on simultaneously, so I'm kind of bouncing between all of that. Mr. Overracker, I was down at the southwest border touring some CBP facilities in Yuma, Arizona on Sunday, and I asked CBP whether they had seen an uptick in fentanyl coming in from Mexico in the Yuma sector. The answer was no, they had not seen an uptick, and in fact, drug interdictions on the whole are down across the Yuma sector as the CBP checkpoints were shut down for months because of the humanitarian crisis on the border. And that meant CBP agents could not staff those checkpoints during the border emergency, given the huge influx of people. So my question is, the data show interdictions are down, but with those checkpoints closed, I'm not sure we can rely on those data this year. And are there other CBP sectors being similarly impacted by this humanitarian crisis at the border? And is there anything you can tell us about the way the cartels are using and profiting from the humanitarian crisis to overwhelm our agents, and then get the drugs in along the way? What can you tell us about that?
Thank you for the question, sir. The first thing I would say is that what we're tracking right now is overall our interdictions on the southwest border are as much as we had last year. But that includes not just what Border Patrol does at checkpoints, that includes our ports of entry. And roughly 90% of what we seize is at a port of entry as opposed to between the ports by the Border Patrol. I understand the humanitarian crisis has impacted their operations. They've also impacted the operations at our ports of entry as we've redirected CBP officers to support the Border Patrol sector. As a result, we've had to close lanes at ports of entry, which has slowed the amount of traffic. But given that 90% of what we seize is at a port of entry, we're seizing just as much as we did last year overall as an agency. But with respect to the other Border Patrol sectors, I will gladly take that back and get you more information on what they're seeing as well.
You might take another look at it because some data we were seeing over the weekend showed that it was down considerably in some categories.
Some categories.
And so I just want to make sure that we know your folks are getting overwhelmed when you've got thousands of people coming in a given night, or hundreds where you had 10 or 20 or 30 in the past. And I know we've got colleagues who want to get rid of CBP or get rid of ICE and don't respect the tough conditions and what you and your folks are doing on things like this. But we keep hearing they're being pulled aside to do the processing of the asylum claims. I mean, there's a lot of this work being done. They're not out in the field doing the interdictions. And so to what extent do you think this humanitarian crisis at the border is affecting the ability to interdict these drugs?
Well, like I said, it has impacted not only the Border Patrol resources between the ports of entry, is also impacting field operations at the ports of entry in terms of just the manpower that we have to dedicate to those traditional interceptions.
Right.
But I think at the port of entry, we've seen things stabilize. And of course, with the apprehension numbers declining now between the ports of entry, we think that the situation is improving.
All right, Mr. Prince, do you have any comment on this from your agency's view? DHS.
Most of the agents that are responding to the border crisis are responding to human smuggling or human trafficking events. The border crisis at some point could create a tipping point for us in the investigative space. At this time, we're not seeing that. We are deploying bodies, agents to the border. Most of the agents that are responding are already at those special agent in charge offices along the southwest border. I will say that it has created some opportunities for us to open up new portfolios in the investigative tool space, one of those being DNA testing. And the DNA testing is allowing us to actually separate children who are being used in a human trafficking scheme or a smuggling scheme.
We met with some investigators who had just gotten that tool and said they can turn a DNA test in 90 minutes, I think they told us.
And the DNA testing is actually identifying children that aren't of these individuals that are crossing the border with them. And so we're rescuing kids in this effort.
Yeah, all right. Madam Chair, my time's expired. Thank you all.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to the panel for being here. Obviously, we all know well the threat that fentanyl is posing to the health and safety of our communities. We've been hearing a lot of very strong testimony on that, and the experience in our districts clearly bears that out as well. And it has to be a very coordinated role, which you're trying to project here today. I appreciate that. I did, Mr. Chester, want to focus a little bit more on the role of ONDCP because it asserts this coordinating function among all the various agencies that we need leaning in to address this crisis and this threat in terms of how our federal agencies are responding. So tell me a little bit, to try to illustrate the coordinating role, what would be happening if your agency did not exist in terms of being able to pull the resources together across these agencies?
Well, the first thing, Congressman, I think there would be a lack of focus and a lack of direction in advancing the administration's drug control priorities. And that's one of the more important functions that ONDCP does, is to document our priorities and lay out the lines of effort that we're gonna operate on. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that the day-to-day activity of ensuring that when departments and agencies are doing things in the drug control space, they're doing it for a higher purpose, and they're doing it to get complementary effects from other departments and agencies that are working in the same space. This happens all the time in government, right? You've got 3 or 4 departments and agencies that are redundant. They're doing the same thing. They don't know that the other ones are operating and that they're doing that. The third thing is, when it comes to the interface between what we're doing on the national security and law enforcement side of the house and what we're doing in the public health space. And we've said from the very beginning that we can be as productive on the front end of the supply chain of drugs coming in the country as we want to, but our true effectiveness has to be measured in the public health space. And you can increase seizures and increase arrests and increase removals in the transit zone and do all of that, but if Americans continue to die from these drugs, then you're not being truly effective. And ONDCP, by being an organization not only in the executive office of the president, but one that has national security, law enforcement, and public health responsibilities, we're the organization that can bring both of those things together in a complementary fashion.
So let me follow up on that. Because that last observation in terms of the health dimension of this, the public health dimension, may be a rationale for why some of the grant programs that you've previously administered are being proposed to be placed in other agencies. The high-intensity drug trafficking areas program, maybe I think would go to DOJ, and the drug-free community support program to HHS. So maybe you could explain why that decision is being made. And then in terms of you're emphasizing, excuse me, the role that the importance, the priority that the administration gives to this fight, and the coordinating sort of traffic cop role that your agency can play in that. I don't frankly understand how the administration has come, I think 3 years running in its proposed budget, with a proposal to cut your budget by 90%. Now, we've restored in our appropriations, we've recognized the value that your agency plays, and I think we even plussed it up over prior years because we want you to play that role. But you need to help me reconcile what you just said, which I agree with, which is this should be a priority, and it should reflect the administration's emphasis here on coordinating the efforts of all these agencies. On the one hand, reconcile that with the fact that the president's budget keeps coming with a 90% proposed cut. On the other hand, which doesn't send, I wouldn't think, the right message in terms of the role you want to play with respect to all of these agencies in terms of coordination. So I won't ask any more questions because I'm out of time, but if you could answer that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Congress. The discussion about those 2 particular grant programs has been going on for many, many years. And the Congress decided where those programs would be originally placed at their inception, and the Congress will decide where they go. I will tell you that both the HIDA and the DFC program are critical to not only the coordination that we do across the federal government, we'll talk about the HIDA program for a second, but the integration of federal, state, local, and tribal together is incredibly important, and to ensure that that function is rolled into the broader efforts that ONDCP does is working very, very well. When we talk about preventing drug use before it starts, I would struggle to find a program more successful than the Drug-Free Communities program in doing just that. And so the placement of the HIDA program and the DFCs together is a great example of what I talked about in bringing our national security, law enforcement, and our public health programs together in one place, and ONDCP is glad to have those programs.
Thank you, Mr. Chester. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and appreciate you calling this hearing. I know how important this subject and other drug issues are to you, and I do appreciate it. Let me quickly say, in response to the previous questioning, that I fully support the high-intensity drug trafficking area program, and it's been very helpful in my district. Mr. Chester, in May of 2017, the Drug Enforcement Administration recovered 50 kilos of NPP. Now, I'm going to botch this up, but that's N-phenethyl 4-piperidinone, if I got close. But NPP is what we'll call it, a fentanyl precursor chemical that could yield about 19 million fentanyl tablets with a street value of more than 570 million. The MPP was found in a storage locker in Northborough, Massachusetts. This recovery of MPP was one of the DEA's largest seizures of a fentanyl precursor chemical in U.S. history. It had been believed prior to that fentanyl synthesis using precursor chemicals is conducted at clandestine labs in China or in Mexico, but this appears to call that into question. Prior to May 2017, do you recall any previous fentanyl precursor seizures of this size indicating possible synthesis occurring here in the U.S.? Yes or no?
I do not recall a seizure of that size prior to that event, no, sir.
And given the size of the seizure, that it was a fentanyl precursor chemical and would presumably support a nearby fentanyl synthesis lab in the United States, would this case be important enough to the Office of National Drug Control Policy, ONDCP, on fentanyl issues to be notified about it and briefed about it? Yes or no?
Yes, it would be, but when I get the chance, I'd like to talk about its NPP's relationship with fentanyl synthesis, but please finish your questions.
Let me keep moving. Did the DEA report or brief you? Did they either report to you or brief you or someone else at the Office of ONDCP about this situation?
I don't remember a specific briefing, but we get continual reports from the DEA on drug events.
But you don't remember getting one on this one?
This one is not particularly memorable to me, no, sir.
Even though it would have been a very large size. I mean, this is what it looks like, and it's just one of the precursors. And that's a picture of what they seized. That's a fairly significant amount of precursor when you realize it could be, go back to my notes, 19 million fentanyl tablets with a street value of 570 million. I would have thought you might remember that if you had been informed of it. I understand you don't. That's fine. In cases like this, do you believe sharing information would be helpful to law enforcement?
Yes, and I will tell you that we have many mechanisms to be able to share information and intelligence information. In this particular case, as a precursor chemical, we do know a couple of things. The first one is the presence of a precursor chemical in the United States does not necessarily mean that there's synthesis going on nearby, because precursor chemicals are shipped from the United States to other countries. And the second thing is, about 2 months before that particular seizure, under United States leadership, the international community placed controls on the two chemicals related to fentanyl synthesis, NPP, which was the one that was seized, and ANPP. So
in this case, let's see that picture again if we could. They're, on many of those boxes, they're Chinese characters. It would indicate it did not come from the United States. It came in, the precursor came in from China to the United States.
Absolutely, and it could be, although I don't know this, it could be that the individual was warehousing it for use, not turning it into fentanyl someplace close by. But we don't know.
Okay, and here's my problem, and Mr. Donahue, I'm going to ask you a question about whether or not your agency notified them. But here's my problem. If we found that precursor, it would seem to me you'd want to at least check, see who the storage locker belonged to, do an investigation, and it would seem like to me there needed to be a lot of coordination. And as far as I know, that didn't happen. Mr. Donahue, do you know if your agency briefed other agencies and Mr. Chester's agency on this particular seizure of a large amount of precursor?
Okay, well, I appreciate the opportunity to respond to that. The case is currently under investigation. It's coming up to trial, which is a lot of times why stuff's not put out in the open due to the protections of the people testifying. We daily notify other agencies on seizures that are made. That specific seizure was worked with state and locals as well. It's ongoing. It was built up, and it's still ongoing. And we do these daily, these types of investigations that are international scale. So you mentioned the markings that are in Chinese. They go to our offices over in Beijing, which follow up on those companies, whether we can task a foreign country to do certain intel gathering for us to bring it back, to identify the source all the way back to where the seizure is made. So we do the follow-up on those investigations. So sometimes they take a year, sometimes 6 months, sometimes 2 years, because you're dealing with foreign countries.
We're already on 2 years and doesn't look like we followed up. And look, I think we could just do a lot better job. Mr. Barksdale might have liked to have known about that so he could check those addresses out. I think we do a better job if we're all working together. And as President Reagan said, there's no limit to the amount of good you can do if you don't care who gets the credit. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As others have stated today, the fentanyl threat is unlike any drug problem we have seen before, and it is going to take the totality of the federal government's capabilities to fight it. Each of these agencies has unique skill sets, but they each only see a piece of this picture. We need them to actually come together and pool their resources, information, and expertise. Unfortunately, it does not appear that that's happening as much as it could. For example, committee staff visited CBP's National Target Center and saw how CBP is able to use algorithms to target shipments and packages likely to contain contraband. But that is only as good as the data that is fed into the system, and CBP does not receive all of the data it could from other agencies. So how do we get past this burden, Mr. Overacker? Why are we not getting the most that we can here? What is holding back the progress that we need to realize?
Well, I'd say that, first of all, we do have good levels of collaboration. We do receive data that is required by regulation, and then we fuse that data with other information to try to identify high risk.
But if I might, though, see, when we look at the National Target Center visit, they're saying it's not happening as well as it could. What's holding that back?
Well, there is room for improvement, and I would just say that this is an example within the law enforcement community of where I believe that we need to have investigators get to a comfort level of where they can share their case information with CBP, knowing that as law enforcement officers ourselves, that we can protect those cases, but we can also use that information to advance those cases by basically giving them greater feedback and greater information. So I just think it's a question of education of the investigators in the field of what our capabilities are and what value we can add to their cases.
And what additional data would CBP like to receive from other agencies involved in this fight to feed into your targeting system?
Well, like I said, I think the case-specific information that will allow us to pinpoint target and also provide meaningful interdictions for those agents in the field.
And Mr. Donahue, I understand DEA frequently shares data with CBP on specific cases when DEA deems it appropriate. But what is stopping DEA from providing CBP with more data on an automatic, ongoing, routine basis?
We work with CBP daily down in Mexico City and various other countries. We're mandated by DOJ policy to provide all of our data into the Special Operations Division, where there's over 38 foreign and domestic agencies, both state, local, and federal, that sees that data, that can share it. And CBP has officers stationed in the Special Operations Division. And we work a lot along the border with them, passing information on seizures that we need them to make for our investigative purposes that we can use in a court of law in the United States. So there's daily engagement.
But why then is CBP stating that they're not receiving all of the data that they need to?
You know, they're not tied in directly to SOD, but they can see all of our data there because they have representatives stationed in the Special Operations Division that coordinate with all the other agencies there, to include people out in the field and in foreign offices.
Well, let me give a specific example. If DEA executes a search warrant related to fentanyl and discovers packages containing fentanyl, that include names and addresses, can that information automatically be sent to CBP for it to interdict all related shipments coming in?
If they're working at investigation in conjunction with DEA, they would have it right then and there. We provide all that to our targeting over an SOD, and they would in turn share it with the CBP officer there when they could give value add at that investigation to help identify the people responsible for that seizure.
Mr. Chester, this is one of ONDCP's essential missions, to make sure that these agencies are working together and sharing all of the information that they can. But clearly, there's more that can be done in terms of ongoing information sharing, and for there to be this proclamation by some of the groups saying we're not doing as well as we should. What are the roadblocks here?
Clearly, there are roadblocks. There is always room for improvement in the ability.
What are the roadblocks?
I think some of them may be procedural. Some of them may be technical in nature, the ability for databases to speak to one another on a routine basis. And as those issues arise, we absolutely are more than happy to work with the interagency to try and reduce them, as you pointed out.
But why can't we link up more of these data systems so that the agencies can help one another?
Yes, sir. We would have to take a good close look at the reason why it's not happening and fix that problem. We absolutely will.
We have a crisis on our hands. Why
Yes,
are
sir.
we not taking that closer look?
Yes, sir.
We could look at it. Why aren't we?
We absolutely will look at it. This particular case that you raised, we absolutely will take a look at why the information is not routinely shared, and we will reduce that barrier and make sure that that happens.
Madam Chair, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Brooks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for holding this incredibly important hearing. I'm really pleased that we're focusing in large part on law enforcement issues. I'm a former U.S. attorney from 01 to 07, and so worked with all of your agencies, was there when Homeland Security was stood up, and so just want to thank you all very, very much for your work. I think what the frustration is we're trying to determine if there are any legal barriers, legal authorities, or anything that is keeping the agencies from sharing at the level that we all think you should be sharing at. And so my question is to any of you and your counsels who might be here, are there any legal barriers that exist in law that are keeping you from sharing information? Discovery issues, is there anything? I'll start, Mr. Don, anything you know of?
Well, I think that depends on what the seizure is, if it's actually in judicial processes, is it actually protected information from other countries? But there is no legal, policy or anything preventing us from sharing information. I can tell you what we've done in Mexico City in our offices. We have HSI agents and FBI agents sitting right in the office with DEA for that deconfliction purpose and for the immediate sharing of information.
Okay, and do any of the other agencies know of any legal reasons why our law enforcement agencies aren't sharing or can't share anything? Or is it just operational?
I'm not aware of any
Okay.
legal restriction.
Okay.
And I think our default position always should be, we have an obligation to share.
Okay, and I assume, is that anything different?
Again, yeah, I'm not aware of any legal
Okay.
prohibitions, but I think that, the size of some of these agencies, these are large enterprises that we're talking about, but a lot of these gaps are closed through deconfliction houses, case coordination such as OCDEF, HIDA, a lot of these things I'm sure you're very much aware of, and I think it's not, these aren't insurmountable issues. These are issues that we collaborate on daily.
Right.
With respect to the international space. It's
Okay,
also-
just wanted to make sure there were no legal impediments, because actually Mr. Donohue's talked about a legal impediment, which I've been very concerned about for a long time, and it's the encrypted phones, which we have not resolved, have we, Mr. Donohue?
No, we've been pending that issue for years now.
Okay, and could you very succinctly remind us all what that is?
So it's a law that's going to enable us to judicially intercept a device that's signed by a judge on a target that we can demonstrate is violating U.S. law.
But then the encryption is what's keeping you from getting to the information in the phone, is that correct?
Correct. Certain companies don't cooperate, aren't obligated to cooperate to give us the technology to intercept the encryption.
Okay, I want to talk about some of the technology challenges, and Mr. Prince, you talked about the dark web, and can you please share with us what, how it is that it's more of a law enforcement challenge than, other issues that we've seen, and whether the issues with cryptocurrency, and I just read that Facebook is now contemplating a currency. Can you please talk with us about any successes or challenges you're having on the dark web?
The successes I mentioned in my oral testimony. The challenges are obviously with respect to cryptocurrency, and that when we're looking at transactions that are occurring in the darknet, and the darknet is largely where nefarious activities are occurring and transactions are happening, we don't necessarily know what these purchases and sales are unless or until we arrest an individual who is engaged in this criminal activity and perhaps commandeer their account, in which case we can see their entire wallet and what those transactions translate to. If we're looking at it from the outside in, what we see is transactions that are occurring. We can presume that those transactions are in fact criminal in nature because we're in the darknet space, but we don't know what they're selling, what they're buying. And so those are some challenges, but we overcome those challenges through a variety of different techniques that I can't really get into here.
Right.
But certainly we do make an impact, and we are making inroads in that space.
I'd like to follow up on that further, but one thing that I know CBP mentioned, but I'd also like to ask you, Mr. Barksdale, can we talk a little bit in my time that I have left about the Narcan availability for, I know it's at key facilities. Obviously, when we're dealing with fentanyl, all the law enforcement, everyone who touches it, it's of significant concern because it could kill. What percentage of postal, and I'm curious, and I think we'll have to do this in written form to all the agencies, what percentage of your officers have access to Narcan?
Well, first, as far as postal inspectors, every postal inspector has access to Narcan.
Okay, good.
All of our drug teams has access to Narcans. On the operational side, all of our key facilities does have Narcan distributed to them, and that would include all of our processing and distribution centers and other large facilities. As far as the percentage of employees that covers, I'll have to get back to you with an exact.
Okay, and I'll be submitting for written questions about the availability of Narcan, the percentage of your employees that are all covered or have access to that, because I think this is a serious issue for law enforcement. Thank you, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for hosting this incredibly important hearing. Thank you for the witnesses to be here today and for your service to our country. A number of complexities that and hard issues that have been brought up over the course of the testimony today, and I appreciate your focus on that. I want to try to drill down on some of that, given that Congress has the opportunity to make some changes here and some investments here that I think are necessary, although we need to do that right. So, Mr. Overacker, you told us earlier that, quote, most of the illicit fentanyl entering our country by weight does so at ports of entry along the southwest border by private vehicles, pedestrian and commercial vehicles, and that, quote, fentanyl entering from the northern border does so by international mail packages and express consignment courier, end quote. So, in your opinion, sir, would a border wall at a cost of up to $25 billion be the most effective way to stop fentanyl from arriving to our country through mail and ports of entry?
Let me just say that I think when we talk about border management, you have to have a comprehensive approach. Most of what we encounter is at a port of entry, but we are working working to change our concept of operations at these ports so we can increase the scanning rates. And when we increase those scanning rates, I think it will have an impact on the patterns of crossing. And if we deter these drug
Understood.
deter them from coming to the ports, they're going to go someplace else.
Right. So I'm going to interpret that based upon the phasing in which you answered that question as a no, not the most effective way to spend the initial first $25 billion. So if Congress was to appropriate $25 billion to the CBP to combat fentanyl trafficking, would you choose to spend that money on a border wall or, as you said, increase technology focus on screening cars and pedestrians at ports of entry and packages arriving through the mail?
Well, in the 2019 appropriation, we received $570 million to improve our scanning capabilities at ports of entry.
And given what you just said, we're not there yet in terms of trying to...
No, that's going to be a multi-year investment.
Yep.
But that's our first priority right there.
Appreciate that, sir. Mr. Donahue, if given $25 billion by Congress, do you believe the most effective way at stopping the arrival of illicit drugs to the United States is a border wall?
Well, again, collectively with all different tools, I can't say, it won't help. I mean, I can't say it's the solution, but it would help. It's just another tool in our toolbox that we can actually filter certain threats to certain areas where we can focus on and use our personnel more.
But the most, if you had $25 billion, was the intervention that you would go with first, a border wall?
It would just be part of our comprehensive plan on how we approach the issue.
And sir, you touched on the importance of treatment and recovery options here in the United States as a way to reduce demand. Do you think that the $25 billion border wall would help us increase access to care in places like Massachusetts that would lead to reduced demand?
I mean, again, that's part of our we believe in the rehabilitation, we believe in the demand reduction, and the enforcement and the international focus on the sources of supply. So we'd spread that money out, looked at it collectively on the entire problem.
And so that $25 billion could be spent on something like Medicaid, which is the largest payer of mental behavioral health services in the country, that cares for more than 40% or nearly 40% of all adults with opioid addiction in the country.
It would help that too, and our concern is they have less drugs and less flow into the United States, so you have less drug addicts and less people dependent on that program.
And so, if understanding your answer that would help, expanding access to Medicaid would be a critically important part to ensuring that people get access to the treatment that's necessary.
The DA doesn't run anything on Medicaid. We're targeting the cartels that are responsible for bringing the drugs into the country.
Right, but as you said, if you're trying to reduce demand, getting people treated that are affected with addiction is probably part of that, no?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Mr. Chester, on multiple occasions, the administration has proposed gutting ONDCP by 95%. Do you believe that our response to this epidemic would be improved without a centralized agency tasked with leading that response?
As the central EOP office for advancing the administration's drug control policy, ONDCP has been very effective at doing that role.
Do you think cutting your budget by 95% would make you more effective or less effective?
Well, clearly cutting our budget by 95% would make us less effective, but I will also tell you that the administration's support for ONDCP has been very strong, and they've allowed us to do our jobs very, very well in this particular crisis.
Would you characterize a proposed cut by 95% as being very strong support, sir?
The proposed cut by 95% was the inclusion of the other two programs that were very pricey. So it wasn't 100 people from ONDCP became 5 people. But what I will tell you, the relationship that we have with the administration, they have allowed us to be able to do our jobs at advancing the drug policy across the federal government.
So why do you think they'd propose cutting your office by 95%?
I think that these were all parts of budget discussions in the past, but we're all very glad that ONDCP exists and continues to do its good work to this day.
Me too. Thank you. Yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Mullen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My questions are going to be for Mr. Donahue and Mr. Overacker. If you could both kind of answer when you can. How much fentanyl is coming directly from China?
So the fentanyl that comes directly from China, typically we see that in mail or express. And I can tell you that...
I mean, how much? I mean, give me, like, how much have we stopped, how much we estimate is entering the country from China directly?
Well, the numbers have dropped precipitously this year.
Okay.
So we're talking about only pounds of fentanyl that we have encountered so far this year.
Mr. Donahue?
We couldn't give you the exact number coming in because we only know what we know. We can give you our seizure numbers.
Right, that's what I'm looking for. How much have you seized?
So I'll get those exact seizure numbers for you. Okay. One thing we're looking for in China is actually the precursor chemicals coming from China to actually utilize to produce more fentanyl.
How much is coming over our southern border that we're apprehending?
On the southern border, that's where basically most of what we're seeing.
Great.
And I think for this year, we're tracking at over 1,800 pounds or
1,800
close
pounds?
to 2,000 so far. But this is not pure fentanyl. This is fentanyl that would be either
it's laced, right?
Yeah, laced or cut or however you want to.
I get it, Mr. Donahue. Would you agree with those numbers?
Yes, they seem accurate. We see a lot going up through the corridor through Tijuana in Mexico.
Are we grabbing most of that at the port of entry?
Absolutely, 90% of our seizures occur at a port of entry.
And if I'm not mistaken, we're only inspecting roughly 20% of the vehicles. We're only able to inspect 20% of the vehicles coming across the port of entry. Is that correct?
Well, currently our scanning rates for privately owned vehicles coming across the southern border are around 2%. And it's roughly 16% for commercial vehicles, and that's really a function of the volume of what's crossing. We have
well, the point I'm trying to get to is my colleague that was before me was bringing up the 25 billion for the southern border for building the wall. And underneath the president's proposal, he also designated a significant amount of money for the port of entry to scan 100% of the vehicles as they was driving through. Because right now we're only expecting roughly 20%, and we're already catching the largest amount but through port of entry. To get back to what my colleague was referring to, would the wall work? Well, what the wall would do is draw more people to that port of entry. Is that not correct? If the wall is there, then they would have to look for a different avenue to be able to enter the country through, which would be the legal point of entries. Mr. Donahue, would you like to respond to that?
Well, we do a lot of great work with CBP and passenger information when we can drive people, or operations that we do at the port of entry where we can focus on cars and trucks.
It's to funnel them there to a certain point. So would the wall help funnel that?
Absolutely would.
Mr. Overacker, would you agree with that?
I would say that the port of entry is a controlled place.
Where the open border isn't, correct?
So because it's a controlled place, and we have better opportunities to interdict.
Okay. So my point that I'm trying to drive home here is there's not just one thing that's going to solve this problem, but the amount that we can keep from flowing over our southern border, which is where the majority of the drugs are coming from. If we can get a better control on that and designate dollars specifically for those and make our southern border a harder target rather than right now being an easy target, because as we all know, easy target is an opportunity for success, and a harder target most criminals aren't going to attack. If we're able to make it a hard target, would that help us with combating the overdoses that are taking place and the addiction issues that are taking place here inside the United States?
We look at all tools, because even though we're speaking about fentanyl today, I mean, we're concerned with the enormous amount of methamphetamine that's being produced that's coming up, the enormous amount of cocaine and the heroin as well, which are bulky to bring in, that they need big trucks to do it. So we're looking at every tool possible to identify and disrupt and seize those drugs that are coming in.
With the amount of human trafficking that's going on our southern border right now, the overflow that's taking place, is it distracting your mission from being able to look directly to drug trafficking, or you have to spend resources to the human trafficking side of it too? Mr. Overacker, you want to?
Well, there's no question that the current conditions on the southwest border have caused us to have to shift our personnel, and so it does have some impact. There's no question about that.
See, what I'm thinking is that the cartels are purposely flooding our southern border so that the drug routes can be easily accessed, because they know that we're having to put resources to the human trafficking crisis that's taking place and the humanitarian crisis that's taking place. So the wall, to which my colleague brought up, is to help all the above picture, not just one single issue. With that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Duncan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thanks for holding this hearing. I sat here a long time listening because I'm concerned about the 28,000 deaths in the United States from synthetic opioids like fentanyl. And my colleague made a great point just now that cartel are going to exploit weaknesses or crisis to get their product across. I think they are. I think walls do work. I think they create corridors that our law enforcement can better utilize the resources we give them within those corridors to stop the bad guys from wanting to bring these horrendous drugs into our cities and killing our fellow Americans. Having sat here sat here for several hours listening to all the other questions, one of the benefits or challenges being last is all the groovy questions have been asked. Y'all have been great to answer those questions. I want to give you a chance to tell us what more we can do in Congress. We passed the Support Act last year, the Support for Patients and Communities Act. I want to see the implementation of that, but what I would like to do is just ask Mr. Overacker first, what can we do in Congress to help keep our law enforcement officers best positioned to continue infiltrating the supply chain? What more can we do?
Well, thank you for that, Congressman. First of all, I'd just like to say that we're very fortunate that Congress has supported us most generously over the last 2 budgets with respect to our detection capabilities. And so we're grateful for that. We know we have a multi-year effort to improve our scanning capabilities on the southwest border, but also throughout CBP. We're also grateful for the continued support we've received with respect to improving our laboratory capabilities and also appropriations for improving our facilities. That's an important part, particularly what we're doing now to improve the international mail facilities where we process mail with U.S. Postal Service. So that continued support is most helpful for us. And so that's what I would say. Just thank you for the support we've received so far.
Let me ask Mr. Donahue, from the DEA standpoint, what can we do to help you disrupt the distribution process of opioids, and what more can we do?
I think having hearings and meetings like this and keeping it to the forefront is really important, and inviting DEA to these meetings. We bring something specific to the table where you have an extraordinary amount of resources in our overseas offices, which where the drugs come from, the cocaine, the methamphetamine, the heroin, the fentanyl. It all comes from international and other countries. So bringing this to the forefront, I think, is really important for DEA and letting our message get out there. And I think having the youth and other people seeing the damage of the drugs that are coming in from a foreign country, just to damage our cultures and our communities, is really important, not to do it every 6 months, but to do it daily.
I've got my best friend from college is a doctor, and we talked about fentanyl just this week. And we were talking about the smuggling efforts. And as you guys become more and more effective, my concern is the very potent fentanyl could be put into food supplies as part of the smuggling effort in containers and contaminate food supply that ultimately gets in. Not talking about drug users that are looking for that stronger high. I'm talking about fentanyl gets into an area where it contaminates food or liquids that ultimately end up in the digestive systems of just average Americans, and then we have a lot of other innocent deaths. I want to ask Mr. Prince with HSI, as containers are being brought in, I know HSI is doing a great job overseas. Is that a reality that we should think about? Is fentanyl contaminating any other sort of food supply or liquids that are coming into this country?
I think it's an abstract thought that I have that I'll share, but lack of imagination is something that we shouldn't have when it comes to fentanyl, in the same sense that you can think about 9/11 and how that happened. So we should have an imagination about the various ways that fentanyl can be introduced into the United States as we put pressure on organizations. We should be creative. We should continue to leverage tools that we have. We should continue to create new tools and expand our aperture within the cyberspace. And don't forget about as I mentioned earlier, our analog tool sets that allow us to also be effective.
Madam Chairwoman, before I came to this committee, I was on Homeland Security Committee, and I was on the Border and Customs, Border Patrol, Border and Maritime Subcommittee. We went to the ports, and we looked at container security, and we looked at the screening for radioactive devices. We looked at what drug smugglers have done. But fentanyl being put on containers is going to be very difficult for these guys to detect. That's something we ought to consider in future hearings, and with that, I yield back.
Yeah, the gentleman's right. Fentanyl is really difficult to detect, and that's one of the real dangers. I want to thank all of the witnesses for coming today. Your participation has been very informative and helpful. I do have a document that Ms. Schakowsky asked me to enter into the record. It's an article from the International Journal of Drug Policy, and I'd ask unanimous consent. So ordered. I can assure all of you and everyone in the audience, this committee does intend to stay on this issue. This has been a multi-year process, a bipartisan process, and we intend to continue to look quite closely at it because it is really a national crisis. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for recognizing it as such and for increasing your cooperation between your agencies. I also want to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by witnesses who have appeared before the subcommittee. I would just ask if all of our witnesses would agree to respond promptly to any such questions if you receive any. I think you'll be getting some from Ms. Brooks, for example. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned.